I've got a groundbreaking idea. In this video, I'm going to do something never before seen on YouTube.com. A secret known only to the elders of PC building. The way to budget gaming nirvana. Upgrading a pre-built. Yes, I know, your mind is blown. You're welcome. Today I will be transforming this humble retired workstation PC, street price around 50 quid, and turning it into a killer of consoles.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you this important message from Exter. Yes, that's right, Exter, the wallet guys. They've asked me to warn you, citizens of the internet, about the tyranny of air. The average person is forced to breathe air between 17,000 and 30,000 times per day, every day, against their will. Until someone frees us from the grip of the oxygen-nitrogen industrial complex, we'll have to make do with the Exter Travel Pack vacuum kits. This miracle of modern travel technology eradicates this so-called air from your packed clothing, reducing its volume by up to 60%. Pack up your clothes in this bad boy, turn on the included rechargeable vacuum attachment, and watch it suck all the air out, shrinking it to a smaller size than you ever thought possible. Save yourself time and hassle cramming your life into your suitcase with the Travel Pack vacuum kit from Exter, and breathe a little easier. Like a chump.
Thanks to Exter for sponsoring this video. Check out the link in the description. And it was a joke. Please don't try to function without breathing. It's not a scam. Honestly. Oh god, I've convinced you that air's a scam, haven't I? I've accidentally created the air truther movement. There's no unringing this bell now. I've created a monster. A while back, I made a video called PC Gaming When You're Broke, in which I demonstrated what could be done with a Dell Precision 5810 workstation, a SATA SSD, and a bunch of free or cheap games. There are a lot of options out there for pre-builts that can be picked up for similar prices, but I have a particular affinity for these big old workstations that can have a second life as a cheap gaming rig, like the Lenovo P500 I used in my last console killer video, because you can do so much with them. These aren't mainstream platforms, they're Intel 2011 v3, meaning you can get cheap CPUs with literally dozens of threads and tons of cache on relatively modern architectures. The RAM is quad-channel DDR4 and there's still room for a decent-sized graphics card. Kinda. We'll come back to that. Of course, for £51, it didn't come particularly well equipped by today's standards. You may remember it arrived with a Haswell quad-core, equivalent to a fairly slow 4th Gen i7, as well as 4 4GB sticks of DDR4, no storage, and a GTX 750 Ti cosplaying as a professional graphics card. It's still very capable for certain types of game, as I demonstrated in the last video, but if this thing was going to be delivering a console killer experience, it needed some upgrades. Starting with the CPU, I swapped out the E5-1620V3 for a 2667V4, which is a spiritual predecessor to the i9-9900. Its Broadwell architecture is an older version, but built using the same 14nm process. It has the same 8 cores and 16 threads, and while the clock speeds are a hell of a lot lower, it actually has 9MB more L3 cache. It's perhaps not the most exciting chip on the platform. I have an E5-2696V3 with 18 cores waiting for an excuse to be benchmarked, but it has roughly feature parity with a console CPU, and it can be had for about £20. Since updating the BIOS, my 5810 can now boot from an NVMe SSD, so I found a 1TB Western Digital Blue drive that I had lying around and slotted it into the top PCIe slot using a generic M.2 adapter, which together are worth in the region of £75. I didn't upgrade the RAM. I could have done, it's not exactly expensive these days, but my reference point for this build was something like a base PS5 or Xbox Series X, which have 16GB of unified memory. It's been said that the PS5 can allocate about 12.5GB of that unified memory pool to VRAM, and that is the bigger concern here. Usually when I do these videos I'm trying to emulate the same hardware as the PS5, so I tend to use Radeon GPUs like the RX 6700 and 6750 GRE. They don't quite cut the mustard anymore due to their 10GB of VRAM and the fact that RDNA 2 graphics cards don't seem to be aging as well as the consoles in terms of optimization. I'd like to have used a 16GB RX 9060 XT, but it's a bit expensive for this project. As the goal is to make a console killer rather than a console equivalent, and the targets are the more mainstream Xbox Series X and PS5 rather than the cheapo Series S I looked at last time, I went with what I decided was the more sensible choice, the 12GB RTX 3060. This is perhaps a tiny bit weaker than the RX 6700, but it has more VRAM and also the advantages that come with an Nvidia of this generation, those being better quality upscaling, better memory compression, and more RT titles that are optimized for them. I was considering the 2080 Ti, which trades off a gigabyte of VRAM for quite a lot more overall performance, but it has a couple of issues. One is practical. The PC has a 685 watt power supply with 2 PCIe connectors, and while I do have extra power cables to get around that limitation, the other problem is architectural. DLSS transformer takes a big performance loss on old Turing cards, and I fully intend to be upscaling the hell out of these games. That being said, I did have a couple of practical issues with the RTX 3060 too. This Dell machine's very clever, easy to use side panel has a quick release mechanism, and by removing a plastic cover on the back, it can normally fit quite large GPUs. However, this particular RTX 3060, a Millsy model from AliExpress, had its PCIe connector right where the bar is, so rather than mess around, I just used it with the side panel off. Also, I ended up using one of those extra power cables anyway. The adapter I was using to combine the two 6-pins into one 8-pin caused the PC to hard reset when I loaded up Cyberpunk, so instead I used a 10-pin to 8-pin I picked up on eBay for 12 quid. All in all, these upgrades should cost somewhere in the region of £250 to £300, meaning you could expect to pay somewhere in the region of £300 to £350 in total, if you can find the 5810 for a good price. If not, there are very similar alternatives, like the previously mentioned Lenovo P500, as well as the HP Z440, and probably a bunch more. I recommend the models which use E5 CPUs, as the E3s are similar to the desktop i5s and i7s, and so are mostly stuck to 4 cores or less. Also, V1 and V2 chips are old Sandy Bridge and Ivy Bridge series on the original socket 2011, and while these are very cheap, they do have some game compatibility problems and don't perform as well as the V3s and V4s. Each of these workstations has their own quirks, and you should really do your research before committing to buying one so you're not caught with a massive PC that won't work because you can't get hold of some obscure adapter. However, all of this advice could be meaningless if this so-called console killer can't perform. This year, the 9th gen console enhancements finally made their way to the PC version of GTA 5, and they run pretty damn well. Obviously, I wanted to make sure I had some ray tracing enabled, and I wanted to match the 60 FPS of the PS5 version's Performance RT mode, so I ran my custom benchmark run, that I stole from Crisp, and with VSync enabled and DLSS performance, I was hanging around the 60 FPS mark most of the time. I applied a frame limit in RivaTuner, which is part of MSI Afterburner, and this allowed me to get a nice, mostly flat frame time graph. Performance only really started to drop when I arrived at the area known as Jack's Hill, which is heavy on vegetation and causes drops into the 40s. I spent probably too long trying to get ray-traced Cyberpunk working well on this setup. The console version sucks. It's 1440p 30fps with dynamic resolution scaling, and all you get for your trouble is lousy local shadows. I wanted to at least have reflections be ray traced, so I tried a bunch of stuff. I tried DRS, which didn't really work. I tried DRS with transformer mode, and that really didn't work. I finally settled on 1440p with balanced DLSS in the legacy CNN mode, and after using Reaver Tuner to cap the FPS at 30, it wasn't a horrible experience. Was it playable? But did it look good? Also no. Going for 60 was much more achievable, looking a hell of a lot sharper, even if sometimes the lack of RT reflections really stood out. The difference in gameplay experience, however, was Night City and Day City. Marvel's Spider-Man 2 can be overly demanding on CPUs, so I decided to stick with the 30 FPS target rather than disappoint myself aiming for 60. This was 4K with DLSS performance, high quality and high RT presets, and once again I'm using a frame limiter to iron out the bumps in the frame time graph. I could definitely play the game like this, especially with a controller, but in reality I'd probably end up turning off RT and aiming for 60 at lower settings instead. Of all the recent Dooms, I should probably have gone with the Dark Ages. The 3060 can certainly handle it, but I was in the mood for some Eternal. No, not the 90s R&B group. I might have been a touch conservative here because at 4K Nightmare it was hitting the 60 FPS limit with almost no deviation, so I could probably have chosen a higher preset and added some DLSS if need be. I didn't do that many benchmarks without some kind of frame cap for this video, because I'm focusing on playability and the experience, and making the games look and feel good, and placating those people who whine about screen tearing in my capture footage. Although The Last of Us Part 1 would be best played with a 30 FPS cap enabled, I did a proper uncapped benchmark test to make sure the PC could handle it. It managed 42 FPS with lows of 32, so it should be perfectly safe for a locked 30. When the first game in the God of War series to receive an official PC port arrived back in 2021, I was testing it with RX 400 and GTX 900 series GPUs and marvelling at how well it played on the GTX 1070. So the 3060 has no trouble here. Granted, 4K with DLSS performance is only rendering at 1080p internally, but it's not quite the same as native 1080p. It still looks great at the high preset, and despite being a bit more demanding, it's almost locked at 60 FPS. Remember Starfield? Didn't quite turn out to be the new Skyrim, did it? Still, I enjoyed my time playing it, even if it is a bear to run. Frankly, now that Oblivion Remastered is out, Starfield suddenly doesn't seem quite so demanding. I ended up targeting 30 FPS at the high preset, using performance DLSS, and it still managed to stick to it while roaming around the demanding city areas of New Atlantis and Neon. DLSS was a thing by the time Jedi Fallen Order was released, but evidently it wasn't on Respawn's radar at the time, and they never went back to patch it in. I didn't particularly trust the UE4 dynamic resolution scaling system, as it's just a button with no control or indication of what the range of scaling options are, so I just dropped the resolution to 1440p and ran it natively. Aside from loading stutters, which are all part and parcel of the Respawn Jedi experience, it was a pretty smooth 60 FPS the whole time. I'm not sure if it was a GPU or CPU limit, but the enhanced version of The Witcher 3 was a bit too heavy. My test run goes through Novigrad, and things definitely eased up outside the city gates, which is what led me to think it might be the Xeon's fault. Anyway, the RT preset is largely capable of a locked 30, but with several significant stutters, and switching to the high preset without RT would make for a much more consistent experience, if not particularly next-gen. I took the frame cap off again in Red Dead Redemption 2, definitely because I meant to, and not because I forgot. There's a ton of scalability here, and a 60 FPS average is very achievable, but I decided to crank up to the prefer quality end of the slider, and saw a pretty solid 30 FPS in Saint Denis, averaging 34 overall. Naturally, the game looks absolutely stunning at these settings. On the subject of stunning, Death Stranding Director's Cut still looks excellent almost 5 years later. Last time I tested this PC, it didn't have the horsepower to handle the game itself, and I was using it as an example of what could be done with cloud gaming. After these upgrades, the PC is now more powerful than the Amazon Luna server, so running it locally is very much an option, and we now have some control over the settings. When I first started testing, I thought I'd be able to run it at very high, with only quality DLSS to bring it up to 60 FPS, but once I went through the cutscenes, I realised it would be a somewhat compromised experience. Not bad enough to warrant dropping to 30 FPS, but enough that I decided to use performance DLSS instead. That does mean for a few shimmering artifacts from time to time, in what would otherwise be an almost photorealistic game, but it also means for a nearly locked 60 FPS. Now, I am aware that this is a slightly ridiculous premise. A massive honking Dell Precision running Windows 10 with the side panel hanging off is not a substitute for a games console. Insisting on a 4K output and ray tracing was deliberately hanging an albatross around my own neck, and the combination of decade-old server CPU and 4-year-old lower mid-range GPU are more suited to native 1080p gaming. Still, I thought this would be a bit of a pleasant change from my normal benchmarks. I've already reviewed the 3060 in 2025, and I tested the CPU back in 2023, and there's only so many ways you can make this stuff not seem repetitive. I'll probably do another video with a more serious upgrade in the near future, maybe with a 4070 or a 9070 or something like that, just to see how high we can take this concept. Should you do this? Well, if you have an old workstation, or the disposable income to afford one and the space to store it, and are curious about what it can do, yeah, why not? As your one and only PC, maybe not so much. Thanks again to Exter for sponsoring the video and fighting the good fight against the oxygen-nitrogen industrial complex. Check out the first video on this PC if you haven't already. Kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.